Tonight, we go to the places where the living aren't supposed to be. The graveyard shift. That stretch of hours between midnight and dawn that even the most seasoned workers describe with a kind of hollow unease they can never quite explain away. It's not just fatigue. It's not just the darkness or the silence. It's something older than that. Something that seems to breathe in those hours when the rest of the world is asleep and the boundary between what we understand and what we can't begins to thin in ways that make rational people question everything they thought they knew. You might think that working the graveyard shift at an actual graveyard, or in a place where the dead are close by, would be the kind of thing that only happens in movies. But it doesn't. Thousands of people do it every single night. Groundskeepers, night security guards, funeral home workers, hospital orderlies stationed near the morgue, cemetery maintenance crews, and almost all of them, if you sit them down and pour them a cup of coffee and give them enough time, will tell you something. Something they saw. Something they heard. Something they cannot explain and have never been able to shake. What is it about those hours? Studies on circadian rhythms and human psychology tell us that the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning represent what researchers call the biological low point of the human body. Your core temperature drops. Your cognitive processing slows. Your senses become both dulled and, strangely, hypersensitive in ways that are hard to reconcile. Sounds seem louder. Shadows seem deeper. The mind begins reaching for patterns in things that might not have patterns at all. And in that vulnerable state, something happens to people. Something real and documented and genuinely terrifying. But here's the question that should already be forming in your mind. What if it isn't just the biology? What if the reason those hours have been called the graveyard shift across hundreds of years of human history isn't simply because they're difficult to work through? What if those hours are called that because something actually is different about them? Something that science hasn't fully mapped yet. Something that the people who work in those places, night after night, encounter with enough regularity that dismissing it as coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. These are 5 stories. They come from real places and real circumstances. They involve people who were not looking for anything unusual. People who simply showed up for work. And what found them instead will stay with you long after you turn the lights back on. If you turn them back on at all. Let's begin. The first story takes place in a cemetery in rural Georgia. Not a large cemetery. Not the kind you see in movies with elaborate iron gates and ancient mausoleums casting gothic shadows across manicured grounds. This was a working-class cemetery. The kind that exists in small towns across the American South, where generations of families are buried within a few miles of where they were born, where the headstones range from polished granite to hand-carved wooden markers that have been slowly swallowed by the earth over decades, where the grass gets long between the mowing visits and the oak trees grow thick and heavy with Spanish moss that hangs down in long pale curtains and moves in the night wind like something breathing. The cemetery was called Millbrook Rest. It sat off a county road that most locals only used to reach the cemetery itself or the small Baptist church that had once stood beside it before it burned down in 1987. After the church burned, the cemetery became even more isolated. The nearest house was over a mile away. There were no streetlights on the county road. And the cemetery itself had only one light, a single sodium lamp on a metal pole near the front gate that cast an orange circle of visibility roughly 30 feet in diameter and left everything beyond it in absolute darkness. The man hired to look after Millbrook Rest was named Corvus Hale. He was 53 years old when this happened, a former truck driver who'd taken the groundskeeper position after a back injury made long hauls impossible. He was not a superstitious man. He was the kind of man who used words like practical and sensible to describe himself, who didn't go to church but respected those who did, who read biographies and history books and had a general confidence in the explainability of the world that he'd carried with him his entire life without ever having it seriously tested. His job at Millbrook Rest was simple. He came in 3 evenings a week to maintain the grounds, check the fencing, and deal with whatever needed dealing with. Twice a week, He stayed through the night to deter vandalism, which had been a persistent problem since a group of teenagers had tipped over several of the older headstones the previous autumn. On those nights, Corvus would park his truck near the gate, set up a folding chair under the sodium lamp, bring a thermos of coffee and a book, and simply be present. He'd done this for 8 months without incident. He was completely comfortable there. And then came the night of October 14th. He arrived at 10:30, as usual. The weather had been odd all week, warm for mid-October, and then suddenly dropping 20 degrees in a single afternoon, leaving the air with a particular quality he later described as feeling like the inside of a refrigerator that hadn't been used in a long time. Cold but also stale. Still in a way that felt less like calm and more like held breath. He parked. He set up his chair. He poured his coffee. And for the first 2 hours, nothing happened at all. It was around 12:40 in the morning when he first noticed it. A sound from the back of the cemetery, which was roughly 300 yards from where he sat. Millbrook Rest was long and narrow, running east to west, with the oldest graves at the far eastern end and the newer sections closer to the gate. The oldest section was the part that sat in absolute darkness, well beyond the reach of the sodium lamp, deep under the canopy of oak trees that grew largest and thickest there. The sound was rhythmic. That was the first thing that bothered him about it. Not random. Not the kind of irregular sound that wildlife or wind makes. Rhythmic. Like something tapping at regular intervals. He told himself it was a branch. He told himself the slight breeze that had started up was moving a dead branch against a headstone. He poured more coffee. He read another page of his book. But the sound didn't stop. And it didn't vary. Over the next 20 minutes, it maintained exactly the same tempo. And Corvus Hale, who was a practical and sensible man, found that he was no longer reading his book at all. He was listening. He took his flashlight, a large maglite that he'd always kept in excellent condition, batteries fresh, beam strong and reliable. He walked toward the sound. The sodium lamp behind him shrank as he moved east through the cemetery, and the darkness ahead of him deepened around the edges of his flashlight beam until he felt as though he were moving through a tunnel of light with something vast and lightless pressing in on every side. He passed through the newer section, where the headstones were clean and upright and the ground was level and well maintained. Then he passed into the middle section, where the stones were older and some had begun to lean with the slow settling of the earth beneath them. Then he reached the old section. He would later say that the temperature dropped again as he crossed into that part of the cemetery. Not a breeze, not a draft, but an immediate and localized drop, as though he'd stepped through a doorway into a cold room. He stopped. He swept his flashlight across the graves. The names on the stones in this section were barely legible, worn by decades of weather, but he could make out fragments. Dates from the 1800s. Some stones marked with no name at all, just a simple cross carved into the surface and then abandoned to time. The tapping sound was very close now. He moved the flashlight slowly, tracking toward the source. And then he found it. Except that when he found it, there was nothing there. The sound stopped at the exact moment his light touched the area. And what he saw was a grave. An old grave. One of the unmarked ones with just the cross. The ground around it looked disturbed, not dug up, not dramatically altered, but unsettled. Like the earth had shifted. Or settled. Or risen slightly from beneath. Corvus stood there for a long moment, his flashlight on that ground, his coffee back at the folding chair, his rational mind working through the explanations. Ground settling. Animal activity beneath the surface. Roots from the nearby trees pushing up through the soil. All reasonable. All possible. Then the tapping started again. It was coming from directly beneath him. He moved backward so fast that he nearly fell over a neighboring headstone. He caught himself, straightened, stood there with a flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam dancing across the old graves, and he listened to that rhythmic tapping coming up through the earth. Not frantic, not desperate, slow, deliberate, like someone knocking on a door. Now, here is where the history of the subject becomes something more than just background. And this is the part that, once you know it, makes Corvus Hale's experience impossible to dismiss as pure imagination. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the fear of being buried alive was so pervasive and so statistically grounded in actual occurrences that it gave rise to an entire industry of what were called safety coffins. These were coffins designed with a string attached to the hand of the deceased, which ran up through the earth and connected to a bell mounted above the grave. If the person woke after being interred, they could ring the bell. A night watchman, specifically employed for this purpose, would hear the bell and arrange for the person to be exhumed. These watchmen were the original graveyard shift workers. That is, in fact, documented as one of the origins of the phrase. The fear wasn't irrational. Medical records from the 1800s document numerous cases of people who were exhumed for various reasons and found to have moved inside their coffins. The most chilling historical case is that of Essie Dunbar, a South Carolina woman who was declared dead in 1915 and buried. Her sister arrived late to the funeral and begged the minister to open the coffin so she could say goodbye. When they opened it, Essie sat up. She lived for another 47 years. But here's the question that Corvus Hale would have been asking himself, standing over that old grave in Millbrook Rest at 12:50 in the morning. The graves in the old section predated safety coffins. They predated nearly everything. The person in that grave, whoever they were, had no bell, no string, no mechanism for reaching the surface world except their own hands against the wood above them. He did not investigate further. He walked back to his truck. He sat inside it with the doors locked until dawn. He never worked a night shift at Millbrook Rest again. But he did make one inquiry before he left. He found out, through the local historical society, that the old unmarked section of Millbrook Rest had a documented history that the cemetery board preferred not to publicize. In the late 1800s, several of the people buried in that section had died during a regional epidemic, and at least 2 of them, according to handwritten records from the period, had been buried in a state that the attending physician had described in his notes as uncertain. Not confirmed dead. Uncertain. Whether the tapping Corvus heard was rooted in something organic, some geological or biological explanation that science could account for, or whether it was something else entirely, is a question that nobody has answered. What's documented is that the cemetery board, following a meeting held 3 weeks after Corvus resigned, quietly commissioned a ground-penetrating radar survey of the old section. The results of that survey have never been made public. Think about that tonight when you're lying in the dark. Think about what uncertain means when it's written in an old doctor's handwriting in a ledger that nobody opened for 100 years. And ask yourself, if you woke up in the dark, in the cold, with the earth above you, and you knocked, how long would you keep knocking before you stopped? The second story moves us north, far north, into the flat, frost-hardened landscape of northern Minnesota, where the winters come early and stay long, and the darkness at 2 in the morning in January is the kind of darkness that feels like a physical material pressing against the windows of whatever building you're lucky enough to be inside. The building in this story is a funeral home, a family-owned establishment that had been operating in the same location for 3 generations. It was called Vargith & Sons, named after the family that founded it in 1931. By the time this story takes place, the current operator was a man named Decker Vargith, a 3rd-generation funeral director who'd grown up in the building, knew every creak and groan and mechanical sound it made, and had long since developed the practical detachment that people in that profession cultivate out of necessity. When you spend your life around death, you either find peace with it or you find another career. Decker had found peace with it. Or so he thought. Vargith & Sons was a Victorian-era building, 3 stories tall, with a funeral parlor on the ground floor, the family living quarters on the second, and the preparation room, which is the clinical term for the room where the actual work of preparing a body for burial takes place, in the basement. The building had a particular smell that visitors always noticed and family members had long since stopped perceiving, a combination of formaldehyde, floral arrangements, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name but impossible to ignore once you'd identified it. The person at the center of this story is not Decker Vargith. It's a woman named Oswin Platt. She was 27 years old, a licensed embalmer who'd been working at Vargith & Sons for 18 months. She was extremely good at her job. Precise, methodical, unflappable. She'd come from a larger mortuary in Minneapolis and had taken the position in the small northern town partly for a change of pace and partly because, as she told colleagues, the work was the work wherever you did it. Bodies were bodies. The dead were the dead. She had no reason to think otherwise. On the night of February 3rd, Oswin was in the preparation room working alone. This was not unusual. Decker trusted her completely and frequently left evening preparations to her, especially in winter when the death rate among the elderly population in the area climbed with the cold. There were 3 bodies in the building that night. 2 were already prepared and resting in the cooler. The 3rd was on her table. The deceased was an elderly man named Theron Gast, 84 years old. He'd been brought in that afternoon, pronounced dead at the county hospital following cardiac failure. His paperwork was in order. His next of kin had been notified. The death certificate had been signed. Everything about the situation was entirely procedural. Oswin was approximately halfway through the preparation process when she paused. She would later struggle to articulate exactly why she paused. There was no obvious trigger. No sound. No movement. Just a sudden, overwhelming conviction that she was being watched. She turned and looked at the door. The door was closed. The hallway beyond it was dark. There was nothing in the doorway. She turned back to her work. And then Theron Gast's hand moved. Not violently. Not dramatically. His right hand, which had been lying at his side, moved slowly. The fingers curled. Just slightly. Just enough that she could see it had not been that way a moment before. Now, before you decide this is simply a matter of muscle spasm, which is a real and documented phenomenon in newly deceased bodies and the rational explanation that Oswin immediately applied to what she saw, let me tell you what happened next. She stood very still. She watched. She gave the science time to do what science does. Post-mortem muscle activity. Electrical impulses in the nervous system firing their last signals. She knew the literature. She'd seen it before, twice in her career, and it had startled her both times but never frightened her, because she knew what it was. Then Theron Gast's eyes opened. Not all the way. Not like the movies. They opened a small amount, enough to show a thin crescent of iris. And then, in a voice so quiet that Oswin later said she wasn't certain she'd heard it or imagined it, he said one word. Cold. She called 911. She called Decker. She did everything correctly. And here's the part of this story that separates it from the category of simple horror anecdote and places it in a space that demands genuine, serious consideration. The paramedics who arrived determined that Theron Gast had a heartbeat. Faint. Irregular. But present. He was transported to the hospital, where he was admitted to intensive care. He remained there for 11 days. And then he died again, this time definitively, with no ambiguity whatsoever. Oswin Platt left the mortuary industry entirely. She now works in accounting. She has not spoken publicly about what happened that night, but a close friend who worked with her at the Minneapolis mortuary shared the story in an online forum for funeral industry professionals in 2019. The thread was extensive. Other mortuary workers responded with their own accounts. Not identical situations, but related ones. Cases of people who seemed unambiguously dead and then weren't. Cases of things said in preparation rooms that couldn't have been said. Cases of movements that couldn't be explained away. One respondent, a mortuary technician who identified herself only as having worked in the field for 22 years in the Pacific Northwest, wrote something that stuck with the people who read that thread and has been quoted across multiple discussions of the topic since. She wrote, "You learn very quickly in this work that the line between alive and dead is not a wall. It's a river. And sometimes people are standing in the middle of the river without anyone on either bank being able to see them." The medical phenomenon at work in Theron Gast's case has a name. It's called the Lazarus phenomenon, officially documented in medical literature as the autoresuscitation of cardiac function after cessation. It has been observed in cases worldwide. A 2018 review published in a European medical journal documented 38 confirmed cases across multiple countries. In the majority of those cases, the time between apparent death and spontaneous return of cardiac function was between 2 and 10 minutes. In at least one case, the gap was over an hour. An hour. 60 minutes of what every person in that room believed to be confirmed, irreversible death. And then something came back. Ask yourself this question. Right now. Really think about it. If the medical and scientific community acknowledges, with documented evidence, that a person can appear completely dead, show no vital signs, and then return, what else are we getting wrong about the line between alive and not alive? And if those people can come back, what is it they experience in that space between? What do they feel? What do they hear? And what do they remember? We don't have the answers to those questions. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all. The third story is different from the first two. The first two involve people who encountered something they couldn't explain. This third story involves something that tried to explain itself. And that is somehow worse. The location is a hospital in the Pacific Northwest. A regional medical center that serves a cluster of smaller communities spread across a largely rural area. The hospital is not named here, and the person who experienced what happened that night requested anonymity when they shared this account, a request that will be honored absolutely. We'll call her Marin. Marin was a night orderly. She was 24 years old at the time, working the overnight shift to put herself through nursing school. Her job involved patient rounds, moving equipment between floors, cleaning and resetting rooms after patients were discharged or transferred, and, on the nights when the census was low, occasional runs to and from the basement level, where the hospital's records room, laundry facility, and morgue were located. The morgue at this particular hospital was a compact and functional room, not the kind of elaborate facility you'd find at a large urban medical center. It had 8 refrigerated drawers, a central examination table, basic fluorescent lighting, and a heavy steel door that locked from the outside. Marin's runs to the basement were not frequent, maybe once or twice a week, and they typically involved delivering paperwork or picking up linens. She had never had occasion to enter the morgue itself. Her work stopped at the door. On the night in question, it was approximately 2:15 in the morning. The hospital was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a busy place at rest, but the particular quiet of an almost empty building, the kind of quiet that has a texture to it, that seems to fill the space rather than simply be the absence of sound. The corridor lighting in the basement level operated on a dimmer schedule after midnight, reducing the overhead fluorescents to about 40% of their normal brightness. This was a cost-saving measure, and an entirely reasonable one, but it meant that the basement corridors at 2 in the morning were lit in a way that created long stretches of deepened shadow between the light sources, the kind of light that shows you enough to navigate but not enough to feel truly oriented. Marin had taken the elevator to the basement to retrieve a supply order that had been left near the records room. She was not thinking about the morgue. She was thinking about the test she had the following week and whether she'd have time to study before her shift ended at 7. She got off the elevator, turned left toward the records room, and was halfway down the corridor when she heard it. Knocking. From inside the morgue. She stopped walking. She stood in the dim corridor and she listened, and she told herself she had not heard what she just heard. She had been moving. There was ambient mechanical noise in the basement level. Ventilation. Refrigeration units. the background white noise of a hospital's infrastructure. She had misinterpreted something mechanical as something else. Then it came again. 3 distinct knocks. Not a rattle or a vibration or the kind of irregular mechanical sound that could be misread. 3 knocks. Even spacing. Like someone standing on the other side of the door and announcing themselves. Marin did not open the door. She was not in any position to open the door, she wasn't authorized to access the morgue, and she was not going to open it regardless of authorization. She backed away from the door until she reached the elevator, kept her eyes on the morgue door the entire time, hit the elevator button, and stood there waiting for what felt like a very long time. The knocking happened once more while she waited for the elevator. This time she counted 4 knocks instead of 3. Same steady rhythm. Same deliberateness. The elevator arrived. She got in. She went back to the main floor and immediately found the charge nurse on duty, an experienced woman named Petra who had worked nights in that hospital for 15 years. Petra did not laugh. She did not tell Marin she was imagining things. She picked up the phone and called the hospital's after-hours security desk. And here's what she told them. She told them to do a check on the morgue, which was phrased in a way that strongly implied it was not the first time such a check had been requested. The security officer who went to the basement reported that he'd found nothing unusual. The morgue was locked. The deceased individuals currently in the drawers were confirmed to be in their proper places and in the expected state. He found no explanation for any sound that might have been heard. But Petra, when she returned to Marin after relaying the security report, said something that Marin has never forgotten. She said, "I've worked this floor for 15 years and that basement is wrong at night. I can't tell you more than that. I just know it's wrong down there. You're not the first person to hear something from that room. You won't be the last. You go home in the morning and you thank God you came back upstairs." Marin did go home in the morning. She finished nursing school. She now works days. She has not worked a night shift since leaving that hospital. And she shared this story, years later, on a professional forum for healthcare workers, where it was met not with skepticism but with a flood of similar accounts from nurses, orderlies, and hospital workers across the country. What's striking about the collection of hospital basement accounts is their consistency. Not in every detail, because the details vary by institution and by individual, but in the texture of the experience. The knocking. The sense of something pressing against a boundary from the wrong side. The response from long-term staff that reads less like surprise and more like resigned familiarity. There's a theory, and it must be stated clearly that this is a theory, which draws on both neuroscience and paranormal research, such as it exists as a discipline. The theory holds that locations where death occurs frequently over a long period of time accumulate what some researchers have called residual energetic imprints. The idea is not mainstream science. It is thoroughly in the realm of speculation. But the researchers who advance this theory point to the consistency of accounts across unrelated witnesses in similar locations as at least suggestive of a pattern that warrants examination rather than dismissal. Whether you accept that theoretical framework or reject it entirely, the pattern itself is real. The stories are real. The people telling them are real and, by all accounts, credible. And the knocking that echoes through those accounts, that steady, deliberate, patient knocking from places where the dead are kept, is one of the most persistent and unexplained threads running through the entire category of graveyard shift experience. Here's the question to sit with tonight. If you were working alone in a building at 3 in the morning, and you heard 3 even knocks from inside a room that was locked and occupied only by the dead, what would you do? Think about it carefully, because the answer reveals something about you, and about what you believe is possible. The 4th story is one that involves not a sound but something seen. And in some ways, what is seen is harder to dismiss than what is heard. This story takes place in a cemetery in the English countryside. A churchyard, specifically, attached to a rural parish church in a county in the West Midlands. The church itself, St. Ambrose at Thornwall, is a medieval structure, portions of which date to the 13th century. The churchyard surrounding it contains graves spanning nearly 800 years of continuous use. The oldest legible stone dates to 1347, the year the Black Death swept through England with a ferocity that historians still struggle to fully convey, killing between 30 and 60% of England's entire population in the space of 2 years. That number is worth sitting with. 1 out of every 2 people in England died within 2 years. The grave density in churchyards from that period is such that the ground is layered with the dead in ways that are genuinely difficult to comprehend. Archaeologists who have surveyed medieval English churchyards have found in some cases up to 9 strata of human remains, layer upon layer upon layer of burial going back to the earliest days of the parish. In a churchyard like St. Ambrose at Thornwall, you are not walking on ground. You are walking on people. Centuries of them, compressed beneath your feet, and the soil between the graves is as much organic human matter as it is actual soil. The man who looks after St. Ambrose at Thornwall is a churchwarden named Aldebert Crane. He is in his early 60s, born in the village, son of a churchwarden, grandson of a churchwarden, a man whose family has been connected to that church for as long as the church's records show. Aldebert is the kind of man who knows the name carved on every stone in that churchyard. He knows the local families they represent. He knows the stories. He knows the history. He is, in every practical sense, the living custodian of the dead who lie beneath his care. He told this story to a local oral history project that was recording accounts from long-time residents of rural parishes in the West Midlands. The recording was made in 2016 and has been referenced in several online discussions of paranormal churchyard accounts, though the original recording itself remains in the local archive. Aldebert told the interviewer that in 40 years of caring for St. Ambrose at Thornwall, he had seen many things he couldn't explain. But there was one night that stood apart from every other thing he had experienced in that churchyard in 4 decades of work there. It was in November. He didn't give the exact year, just that it was in the mid-1990s, which he remembered as a particularly brutal winter that came early and hit hard. He had been at the church late into the evening dealing with a drainage issue near the north wall of the nave. Water had been getting into the crypt, which was a problem both for the structural integrity of the building and for the remains in the lower crypt, which had not been formally used for burial in centuries but still contained the interred remains of several of the parish's historical families. He'd finished the immediate work and was preparing to leave when he saw the figure. It was standing near the eastern boundary of the churchyard, which was the oldest portion, where the graves from the medieval period were clustered most densely. The figure was roughly human in shape, standing still, facing toward the church. Aldebert's first assumption was that it was a person, a visitor, which would have been unusual at that hour in November, but not impossible. The churchyard wasn't locked at night. It never had been. He called out, identifying himself as the churchwarden, asking if everything was all right. The figure didn't respond. He walked toward it. He had a torch with him, what we'd call a flashlight, a heavy-duty one he kept in his work kit. He turned it on and directed it toward the figure. And here is what Aldebert Crane, a man who had spent 40 years in that churchyard and who described himself to the interviewer as not a man given to imagination or fancy, saw when the light reached the figure. Nothing. Not nothing in the sense that the light revealed an empty space where he thought he'd seen something. Nothing in the sense that the light simply did not illuminate whatever was there. The beam of his torch reached the area where the figure stood, and the figure remained visible to him but was somehow unaffected by the light, as though the light was passing through it or around it or being swallowed by it in a way that his eyes registered but his mind absolutely refused to accept. He stopped walking. The figure turned. Slowly. Deliberately. As though it had become aware of him in that moment and was reorienting to face him. And when it turned, Aldebert said, he had the overwhelming and total conviction, not a thought or a speculation but a bone-deep bodily certainty, that whatever was standing in that old part of the churchyard had been there for a very long time. Not just that night. Not just that year. That it had been a presence in that place for a length of time that predated him, predated his grandfather, predated the oldest grave he could put a date to. He walked back to the church. He went inside. He sat in a pew in the dark for 2 hours before he felt able to drive home. When he described this to the oral history interviewer, he said one thing about it that has stayed with everyone who has heard or read this account. He said, "I've never felt afraid in that churchyard. Not in 40 years. Whatever else might be there, I've always felt that it meant nothing bad. But that night, what I saw, it wasn't nothing bad. It wasn't nothing good either. It was simply very old, and very present, and entirely indifferent to whether I was there or not. That was the frightening part. Not malice. Indifference." Theories about what Aldebert may have seen span the full range from rational to deeply speculative. On the rational end, there are explanations involving optical illusions produced by mist over old churchyard ground, which is a documented phenomenon given the combination of ancient organic soil, shifting temperatures, and low light conditions. On the speculative end, there are researchers in the field of place memory and environmental impression who suggest that locations of extremely long-term and high-density death accumulate something that occasionally manifests visually under the right atmospheric conditions. This is firmly in the realm of theory. It should be received as such. But it's worth noting that accounts of figures seen in ancient churchyards follow a pattern that is strikingly consistent across witnesses who have never compared notes with each other. Aldebert Crane continues to care for St. Ambrose at Thornwall. He has never seen the figure again. He says he doesn't expect to. He says some things appear only once, and that once is enough to change your understanding of the place you're standing in. And he says that when he walks past the eastern part of the churchyard now, particularly in the cold months, he does not linger. He does his work and he moves on. And sometimes, as he passes, he says good evening to whatever might be there. Just in case. There's something in that last detail that is more unsettling than almost anything else in this story. The practical accommodation a man makes with something beyond his comprehension. The way the ordinary and the impossible coexist in the reality of his daily work. That is perhaps the most genuinely frightening thing about all of these stories. Not the dramatic moments. The quiet acceptance that comes after. Our fifth and final story begins not with a sound or a sight, but with a smell. This detail matters. Smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotion in the human brain. The olfactory nerve has a more direct pathway to the limbic system, the part of the brain that processes emotion and memory, than any other sense. This is why a smell can transport you instantly to a specific moment in your past with a vividness that visual or auditory memory rarely matches. And it is why, when a smell appears in a context where it cannot possibly originate from any identifiable source, the effect on the human nervous system is profoundly disorienting in a way that goes beyond what sight or sound alone can produce. The smell in this story was flowers. Specifically, old flowers. The kind of smell that comes from floral arrangements several days past their prime, from the particular combination of decomposing organic matter and the residual sweetness of pollen, a smell that anyone who has been inside a funeral home will recognize immediately and never fully forget. It is not an unpleasant smell precisely, but it carries with it an association so specific that encountering it in a context where it doesn't belong triggers an immediate and visceral response. The person who smelled it was a security guard named Zephyrine Okafor. She was 31 years old, a former military police officer who had transitioned to private security work after completing her service. She was, by every account, a composed, rational, and experienced person who had dealt with genuinely dangerous situations and knew the difference between a real threat and a perceived one. She was exactly the kind of person whose account you would expect to be reliable. She had been hired by a property management company to provide overnight security for a building that was in transition. The building had most recently been a funeral home that had operated there for over 20 years before closing when the owner retired, and the property was purchased for conversion into residential units. At the time Zephyrine was contracted, The building was empty and in the early stages of renovation, which meant that the original interior had been gutted to the walls in most areas, but the basic structure was intact, including the basement level, which the renovators had not yet reached. The basement of the building had been the preparation room. She knew this from the building documentation she'd been given. The renovation company had noted it simply as a notation on the floor plan, marked as storage and preparation, lower level, and she had filed it in the category of relevant but unremarkable information. Old buildings have histories. That was not her concern. Her concern was preventing unauthorized access to the property and making sure that the renovation materials stored on the ground floor were not interfered with. She did her first sweep of the building at 11 p.m. when her shift started. Everything was as expected. Empty rooms. Bare concrete walls where drywall had been removed. The smell of construction dust and old building materials. She found nothing. She did her second sweep at 1 a.m. Ground floor clear. First floor clear. She went to the basement. The smell hit her before she reached the bottom of the stairs. Old flowers. Overwhelmingly strong. Strong enough that she stopped on the third step from the bottom and stood there trying to identify the source. There were no flowers in the building. There had not been flowers in the building during any previous sweep. The basement had smelled only of old concrete and damp the last time she'd been down there, 2 nights prior. She descended fully and swept her flashlight around the room. The basement was a long, low-ceilinged space divided into sections by partial walls. The main section, which had been the preparation room itself, still had its original floor drain and the anchor points where the preparation table had been bolted to the floor. The secondary section had been used for storage. Both sections were empty. Nothing to account for the smell. She checked for water damage, for organic material that might have been disturbed by the construction work on the floors above. She found nothing. She completed her sweep, noted the anomaly in her report log, and went back upstairs. At 3 a.m., she returned to the basement. The smell was gone. Completely. Not faded, not diminished. Gone. As though it had never been there. And in its place was something else that she couldn't name or categorize. Not a smell. More like a quality of the air in that room. She described it, in the written account she filed later, as the air being occupied. She said, it felt like the air had recently had someone standing in it. Like walking into a room right after someone has left, that feeling of displaced air, of presence just vacated. Except that there was no one in the building and the basement had been sealed when I came down. She had that feeling for approximately 45 seconds. Then it was gone. She noted it. She left. She did her 4 a.m. sweep and found nothing. When her shift ended at 7 and the site manager arrived, she gave her verbal report and mentioned the smell and the subsequent feeling in the basement. The site manager, a man who had been in property development for 20 years, went quiet for a moment when she described the smell. Then he told her something that the property management company had not included in her briefing documents. The funeral home that had operated in that building had experienced an incident approximately 5 years before it closed. A family had brought in the body of a young man in his early 30s, for preparation and funeral services. The preparation had proceeded normally. The body had been laid out in the viewing room on the ground floor and a service had been held. The family had been present. Everything had proceeded as it should. But during the reception following the service, held in a room adjacent to the viewing room, the deceased man's wife had collapsed. She was brought to the basement level, which was the only quiet and private space in the building, while someone called for medical assistance. She lay on a makeshift arrangement of supply room shelving padded with linens, in the room directly below the viewing room where her husband's body lay. She had recovered. She was fine. But while she was lying there, she told the staff attending to her that she could smell flowers. Very strongly. They noted that there were no flowers in the basement. The flowers from the service were all upstairs. There was no reason for the smell to be present in the basement. She said the smell was like the flowers were right next to her, like someone was holding them close. And then she said something else. She said, "He's still here. He hasn't left yet. He's staying until I can leave." No one knew what to say to that. The medical assistants arrived. She was taken to a hospital. She recovered completely. Her husband was buried the following day. The staff member who had been in the basement with her during those minutes was the same man, now retired, who had sold the property to the development company. He had mentioned the incident to the site manager as part of the general history of the building. He described it not as a haunting or a supernatural event, but simply as one of those things you don't have a proper category for. One of the things you carry with you. When Zephyrine heard this account from the site manager, she said very little. She made a few notes. She asked whether the incident had been documented in writing anywhere. The site manager said that the original owner might have records, but that he didn't have access to them. She worked 2 more weeks in that building. The smell returned once more, on the night of her 11th shift there, just as briefly and just as inexplicably as the first time. She noted it. She filed it. And when the contract ended and the security work at that site was concluded, she told a colleague that it was one of only 3 jobs in her entire career where she had walked away feeling that she had been in the presence of something she didn't understand. She said she didn't mean it as something negative. She said she wasn't even sure she meant it as something frightening, exactly. She said it was more like encountering evidence of a dimension of human experience that she'd never been required to consider before. That the place had shown her something about love and death and the distance between them, or possibly the lack of distance between them, that no book or training or rational framework had prepared her for. And then she said, "I don't know what stays and what goes. I'm not sure anyone does. But something stays. I'm sure of that now. Something stays." Now we reach the end of these 5 accounts. 5 people. 5 places. 5 nights that altered the people who lived through them in ways that no amount of time has fully erased. What do we do with these stories? The rational mind wants to process them, categorize them, assign them to the bins of explainable phenomena and move on. Muscle spasms and geological settling and optical illusions and misidentified sounds in unfamiliar acoustical environments. And for some of what happens in these accounts, those explanations have at least partial traction. They're not dismissible as explanations entirely. But what the rational framework struggles with is the consistency. The way that the experiences of Corvus Hale in a Georgia cemetery, and Oswin Platt in a Minnesota funeral home, and Marin in a Pacific Northwest hospital basement, and Aldebert Crane in an English churchyard, and Zephyrine Okafor in a converted funeral home, share a particular quality that transcends their individual circumstances. A quality of boundary. All 5 of these people encountered something at a threshold. Not in the middle of an ordinary experience, but at the edge of one. At the place where the ordinary stops and something else begins. There's a concept in folklore studies and in the anthropological study of death ritual called liminal space. The word liminal comes from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. It describes the zone between states, between living and dead, between night and day, between the known and the unknown. Many researchers in both the social sciences and in more speculative fields argue that cemeteries, morgues, and places long associated with death are inherently liminal environments. Places where the normal rules of space and time and perhaps even physical law operate differently than they do in the bright, busy, populated world. This is a theory. It should be received as a theory. But it's a theory that has been independently arrived at by people across cultures and across centuries, which is at least worth noting. What is not a theory is the impact these experiences had on the people who lived them. Corvus Hale left his job. Oswin Platt left her industry. Marin left night work entirely. Aldebert Crane changed the way he moves through a space he has tended his entire life. Zéphyrine Okafor carries the question of what stays with her as a permanent feature of her understanding of the world. These are not people who were predisposed to be frightened by their environments. They were workers, professionals, people who had chosen, for practical and ordinary reasons, to spend their nights in proximity to death. And something in those nights reached through all of that practicality and professionalism and practical rationalism and changed them. Not broke them, changed them. Opened something in their understanding that hadn't been opened before and couldn't be fully closed afterward. Ask yourself this, and take your time with it. If you were the one in that chair, in that room, in that corridor, at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, with the darkness pressing in and the silence taking on a texture and something beginning to happen that had no explanation in the daylight world, what would you hold on to? What would you reach for? And afterward, in the morning, in the ordinary light of an ordinary day, what would you do with what you knew? Because these people know something now that they didn't know before their nights. Something about the thickness of the line between here and whatever is on the other side of here. Something about how thin that line can become in certain places, at certain hours, when the ordinary world sleeps and the extraordinary is left to conduct its business without interruption. And the graveyard shift keeps going. Right now, tonight, there are people sitting in folding chairs in dark cemeteries and working alone in preparation rooms and doing rounds in basement corridors lit at 40% and walking through empty buildings that used to hold the dead. There are people at their most alone, in the places where aloneness has the most weight, in the hours when the boundary is thinnest. Most of them will have a quiet night. The tapping won't start. The eyes won't open. The knocking won't come from behind the locked door. The figure won't be visible in the old part of the churchyard. The smell won't arrive with no source to account for it. Most of them. But some of them, on some nights, in some of those places, will experience the thing that Corvus and Oswin and Marin and Aldebert and Zéphyrine experienced. The moment where the explanation runs out. Where the rational framework reaches its edge and the darkness on the other side looks back. And whatever looks back from that darkness has been there for a very long time. It has been there since the first person who ever stayed awake all night beside the dead to make sure they were gone. Since the first bell was installed above the first safety coffin. Since the first night watchman was paid to listen for something he hoped he would never hear. Since the first doctor wrote the word uncertain in his ledger and hoped the morning would bring clarity. Some mornings it does. And some mornings, the people who work through the night come back to the light looking slightly different than they did before. As though something was shown to them in the dark that the daylight world cannot quite accommodate. As though they crossed a threshold in those hours between midnight and dawn and came back carrying something invisible that they will carry for the rest of their lives. The graveyard shift. It will go on tonight, as it goes on every night, in every city and every small town and every rural stretch of darkness where the living keep watch over the dead. And somewhere in those hours, in one of those places, something will happen that cannot be explained. Something always does. Whether you're the one it happens to is simply a matter of when you're scheduled to work. And whether tonight is the night. Sleep well, if you can.